Welcome to the Bridge Design Pattern course. In this course, we'll learn everything there is to know about the bridge design pattern. The bridge pattern is very powerful. In this course, we'll look at the definition, we'll build a class diagram, and then we'll dive into a real-world complex example where the bridge design pattern really makes life easier. And then we'll build the class diagram for that. We'll implement everything in code. And by the end of this course, you should have a deep understanding of what this design pattern is all about. It's important to note that as a prerequisite for this course, you need to be familiar with the adapter design pattern. So without further ado, let's jump right in and talk about the definition of the bridge design pattern. Let's start with the definition of the bridge design pattern. Now, I'm warning you in advance that the definition is not very clear, and only after we talk about the class diagram and we look at an example, we write it out in code, then will the definition make a bit more sense. So for now, we're going to look at the definition. I'll talk about it a bit, but we aren't going to go too deep because the best way to understand what this pattern is about is to just see a good example. So with that, let's look at the definition. So the definition, or the quote from the Gang of Four book, is as follows: decouple an abstraction from its implementation so that the two can vary independently. Now, I'll just say in advance that when we're talking about the abstraction, then we're not talking about an abstract class necessarily, but we're talking about a logical component in our system, a control layer, or some functionality. So just based off the Gang of Four definition, without going too deep yet, what we can notice is the following. We want to take two logical components and separate them from one another so each one of them can grow and morph independently from the other. The core idea behind this design pattern is the following. We want to be able to take two groups of objects. Let's imagine that these are objects in group A and these are objects in group B. This pattern allows us to take each one of the components and have them grow and morph independently, and then for us to be able to mix and match them. So for us to take, for example, this and combine them into a single object. The alternative that we're trying to avoid is for us to need to create a specialized object that would represent the combination of this object and this object together. Because if we would need to create an object to represent both of these together, then we would also need to create an object to represent the combination of two of these together. When we're talking about decoupling the abstraction from the implementation, what we're talking about is for us to be able to take the abstraction and put it in one side, take the implementation and put it on the other side, and have each one of these grow and morph independently, so we don't need to create a class that basically combines both of these objects together. Because if we have an object that combines both of them together, then when we need to create also an object that combines both of these together, then when, let's say, this object changes, we'll need to update both the object that contains both of these objects or represent the combination of both of these objects, and also the object that contains or describes the combination of both of these objects, because this object is contained, or parts of it are contained in both of the objects that are the combination of this object with the other ones. Okay, so if that didn't make any sense, then I promise you this will make more sense as we look at an example and we build the class diagram. This was just for you to have an initial intuition of what this design pattern is about. Now, because we're talking about how we're taking objects and we're structuring them, how we're defining the inheritance or the composition between different objects in order to simplify the overall interface and the system in general, then this falls under what's called the structural patterns. Alongside the bridge pattern, then we also have the adapter pattern, the composite, the decorator, the facade, the flyweight, and finally the proxy pattern, all falling under the group or the classification of structural patterns. Alongside this grouping or classification of the structural patterns, we also have the creational patterns and the behavioral patterns. The classification in general into these different groupings comes from the book Design Patterns Element of reusable object-oriented software. Because the name is hard to remember, this book is usually referred to simply as the Gang of Four book, referring to the four authors of the book. So now that we have a bit of background, let's build the class diagram. So in the bridge pattern, we have four main components. The first component is the what's referred to as the abstraction. Beforehand, when we talked about the abstraction, we were talking about this component and its concretions. Alongside the abstraction, we also have the concrete abstraction, referred to as the refined abstraction. We also have the implementer and the concrete implementer. So overall, we have the abstraction, the refined abstraction, the implementer, and the concrete implementer. Now, the reason why this is called the bridge design pattern is because the way it is structured is as follows. We have in one side the abstraction and the refined abstraction, and on the other side, we have the implementer and the concrete implementer. Between the abstraction and the implementer, then we have a relationship that makes this entire thing look like a bridge. And what we're doing is we're bridging between the refined abstractions and the concrete implementers. So as you would expect, the refined abstraction is the concretion of the abstraction, and it extends it like so. And likewise, the concrete implementer is the concretion of the implementer, and it implements it as so. Now, the abstraction contains in it a reference to an implementer. So over here, we have a private field, which is the implementer, which means that the abstraction has an implementer. So overall, this is what we have. And of course, the beauty is that we don't need to have only one refined abstraction, but we may have multiple refined abstractions, or more correctly, when applying this pattern, then we'll likely have multiple refined abstractions and multiple concrete implementers, because otherwise there isn't much motivation to implement this pattern. Now is where this starts going back to the definition of the gang of four. So we have the abstraction containing in it an implementer, meaning that each one of the refined abstractions, because they extend the abstraction, also has in it a reference to an implementer. Now in runtime, the client will hold in their hand one of the refined abstractions, right? And each one of the refined abstractions will have in it a reference to one of the implementers, meaning that we can represent overall with this structure the combination of refined abstraction number one with concrete implementer number one, number two, or number three. Now, in the next subsection, we'll look at an example and we'll see why this makes complete sense in specific scenarios. But for now, I just want you to have the intuition for why this solution is much more scalable when you have such a structure where you have various objects in one group and various objects in another group, or more correctly, multiple types in one group and multiple types in another group, and how, if you need many combinations between them, why it makes more sense to have this sort of composition instead of creating unique types per combination. So now is a good time to jump into a real world example and see why this pattern is actually very, very powerful.